Welcome to this special event where we shall discuss infrastructure for resilient island states. A week ago, we had the launch of the IRIS by the premiers of India, UK, Australia, Jamaica, Mauritius, and Fiji. It was a short event where this important initiative to work with small island developing states in making their infrastructure systems resilient was launched. So we thought it would be useful to come to the home of SIDS at COP26, the EOSIS Pavilion, and deliberate a little bit more in depth as to how do we operationalize IRIS. What does it mean to translate the ambition of IRIS into actions on the ground in the small island nations. So today we will have a very distinguished panel of colleagues from a number of small island states. We also have ASG Selvin Hart joining us from the UN Secretary General's office. We will also have Ambassador Blacklin joining us a little bit later. She's running late, but in the interest of time, we thought we'll start this session. So to begin with, let's look at a short video of a little over 2 minutes about what the idea behind IRIS is that has been co-curated by the small island nations and CDRI Secretariat and a number of CDRI partners. So with that, because this is sort of a silent zone, unless you're speaking, we recommend that you put on the headsets and that would give you the best listening experience.
Small island developing states, or SIDS, are home to unique landscapes, vibrant cultures, and traditions. However, SIDS also face the highest disaster losses in proportion to their GDP. They face large economic, social, and environmental challenges compounded by climate change threatening their very existence. Resilient infrastructure is a key driver in mitigating disaster and climate risks while also meeting the development aspirations of SIDS. SIDS are already taking actions to implement the Samoa pathway. But this cannot be done alone. There is a need for broader partnerships for resilient island nations. The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is a global partnership that aims to build climate and disaster resilience into infrastructure systems to ensure sustainable development.
I would like to say that CDRI has set a challenging and urgent agenda for itself.
The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. The UK is proud to be its co-chair.
We are all at the front lines of climate-driven disasters, and we all stand our best chance at building resilient infrastructure by working together.
CDRI's Infrastructure for Resilient Island States, IRIS, will promote resilient, sustainable, and inclusive infrastructure in SIDS. IRIS has been co-curated by the SIDS and CDRI partners. It will work in synergy with other ongoing efforts in SIDS. Aligned with the Samoa pathway, IRIS will focus on delivering 3 key outcomes: improving disaster and climate resilience of infrastructure, strengthening knowledge and partnerships for resilient infrastructure, promoting gender equality and disability inclusion through resilient infrastructure. Let us together be a part of a growing community committed to building more resilient and prosperous island nations.
Thank you very much. With that, let me invite the Special Advisor to Secretary General, Mr. Selvin Hart, to share his reflections.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to all of you. It is certainly a pleasure to be home, back home, in the bosom of the small island developing states. Prior to joining the United Nations many years ago, this was my home. And it's always a pleasure to be back with colleagues and friends and to see so many familiar faces. But I'm here wearing a different hat this afternoon, and I'm here to lend the full support of the Secretary General to the evolution of a partnership, an alliance that started in 2019 at his climate summit. And, you know, we've been in frequent conversations with our colleagues in the Secretariat of the coalition over the course of the last 2 years or so. And we're really happy that the coalition has been able to advance its work in a way that benefits those countries, communities, and peoples who stand on the front lines of the climate crisis. The reality is, and the inconvenient truth is, that after 30 years of international climate negotiations, adaptation and resilience remains the neglected half of the climate equation. Adaptation and resilience finance attracts a mere 25% of total climate finance flows. Some 30 years after we started this climate negotiating process. And this 25% translates into about $20 billion a year when we know firsthand that the cost to the developing world, developing countries stand to lose as much as $300 billion a year from climate change, and the adaptation costs can amount to as much as $300 billion a year. So at COP26, we really face a moment of truth. And this is why the Secretary General has been very vocal, extremely vocal in his calls to address the two major challenges faced in advancing this agenda. One is the volume of climate finance for adaptation and resilience. And secondly, it's addressing the long-standing challenge of access to climate finance. As you've seen today from the IRIS initiative and many of the other partnerships and initiatives that have been launched and have been advanced at adaptation and resilience, on adaptation and resilience there. The initiatives are there, the solutions are there, the technologies are there, but the challenge is finance and addressing this issue of access. So this is why, and I hope that all of you will continue to support the Secretary General's call on donors to increase the share of climate finance to at least 50%, from the 25% that it currently stands at, to 50% of total climate finance flows. Donors and MDBs must step up. This is a moment of truth for them. Second is the issue of access. In 2019, SIDS only accessed 1.8% of total climate finance. 1.8% of total climate finance. These are countries on the front lines of the climate crisis. 1.8%. And that was a 25% decline from the previous years. So as impacts worsen across all SIDS regions, their access to climate finance continues to diminish. And the Secretary General has been making 3 calls on the access issue. Reduce the red tape and bureaucracy so that SIDS can better access climate finance, support capacity building initiatives in their regions so that they can better design the programs. And this initiative is one response to this in terms of supporting SIDS to build the capacity they need to better access climate finance, to better develop projects. And third is on the eligibility criteria. It's unfair that SIDS, because of per capita income requirements criteria that were developed a generation ago, before we knew the full extent of the climate crisis, that these criteria are being applied and disadvantaged SIDS who seek to access climate resources. So really great initiative. We will always partner with you, but we're facing this moment of truth where good initiatives like this will be undermined if we don't have the climate finance flowing towards adaptation and resilience, and we don't address these access issues. Time is running out. This is not a race that we can afford to lose. But when we see colleagues joining forces like this, it gives us hope that the race can be won and we can finally solve and address this climate crisis in a way that addresses the needs of those on the front line. So thank you so much. You have our full support and we look forward to this continued partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ASG Selwyn Hart. May I invite the Honorable Minister from Mauritius also to join the panel. And I will facilitate a short discussion. So we are also lucky today to have Ambassador Diane Black-Lane join us for this conversation. She is the head of the Department of Environment in Antigua and Barbuda. We have, I just invited Honorable Minister from Mauritius. He is the Minister of Environment, Solid Waste and Management, Honorable Kavidas Romano. Thank you for having us. And then thank you for joining us in this event. Mr. Carlos Lee Moresi. Thank you for joining us today. And then Madam Luisa Tuayafiato Malolo. She is joining us virtually on the screen there. So maybe I should start with Honorable Minister from Mauritius. Honorable Minister, Mauritius is on the front lines of dealing with the impacts of climate change. It has its own unique development challenges as well. How do you see an initiative like IRIS rolling out in Mauritius? How could Mauritius benefit from it? What would be some of the key success factors in really making things better, more resilient in Mauritius? It's up to you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation extended to me for this session on infrastructure for resilient island states, IRIS. I would like also to thank the organization of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure for organizing this very important event on the implementation of the IRIS, which comes at an opportune time after its launch at the World Leaders Summit on the 2nd of November. The Prime Minister of Mauritius has announced the joining of Mauritius to the IRIS program at the summit. Ladies and gentlemen, just to mention that Mauritius is ranked as the 51st country out of 181 countries with the highest disaster risk. And in view of its geographical location, Mauritius remains one of the most exposed countries to natural disasters. In the 2.3 million square kilometers of extent of its exclusive economic zone, Mauritius has a number of islets and offshore islands, which are very important from an ecosystem, livelihoods, and other socioeconomic perspectives. The Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery report estimates that Mauritius experiences over 110 million USD in combined losses from floods and tropical cyclones annually. Given the country's high vulnerability to the detrimental impacts of climate change, Government of Mauritius has made disaster risk reduction and management a high priority in the climate change adaptation agenda, as well as in the recently reviewed nationally determined contribution for Mauritius. And the government has enacted a number of legislation, institutional setup, and just to mention some of them, we have set up the dedicated National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Center in 2013 for planning, organizing, coordinating, and monitoring disaster risk reduction and management activities. Second, we have the National Disaster Scheme in 2015 with a functional document to support agencies. Third, we have also the enactment of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Act in 2016, which establishes an administrative framework. I should say that we have also a series of enactments, be it the Land Drainage Authority, the Local Government Act, the Climate Change Act, which has been adopted in November 2020 as a proviso for the establishment of a Department of Climate Change. I should say that, ladies and gentlemen, that it is strongly felt that there is still serious capacity limitation, lack of tools, and inadequate expertise at the level of various institutions in SIDS like Mauritius to monitor its natural assets, especially those which are located remotely, to be able to adequately address the degradation thereat in an integrated manner. In view of the current reality and urgency, Mauritius thankfully welcomes the sharing of satellite data and related capacity building as announced by His Excellency Shri Narendra Modi ji, Prime Minister of India. And Mauritius will thus stand to benefit from the IRIS initiative, which is timely to upscale our actions for greater resilience and ultimately achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and NDC targets by 2030. And we think that for us to be able to reach such an aim, we think that it is important for us to adopt a systematic approach through risk and resilience assessments to facilitate risk-informed infrastructure design and planning, strengthen institutional capacities for resilient infrastructure planning and policy development, improve building codes, standards, regulations, as well as certification processes through provision of technical expertise, post-disaster assessments of critical infrastructure sectors to support recovery and reconstruction, and last but not least, research on resilient infrastructure good practices and knowledge exchange. As a concluding note, Mauritius is looking forward to the operationalization of the IRIS project to reap interlinkages and synergies among SIDS, as well as across SIDS regions. Mauritius thanks the Government of India for coming up with this initiative, and also international organization for the support being provided to implement the project by 2030 and beyond for a climate-proof infrastructure and a safer planet. With these words, I thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellency, thank you very much. First of all, it's quite inspiring to see a whole range of actions that your government is taking in increasing the resilience of Mauritius in terms of policy and enabling environment to actual actions on the ground. And indeed, we also look forward to IRIS rolling out in Mauritius, making linkages across SIDS and across SIDS regions as well, and actually delivering results for people in the small island developing states. Maybe after that, for some initial remarks, I invite Ambassador Blacklean. Would you like to speak from there or here? It's your call.
I apologize for being late. I was in the AOC's ministerial meeting. So thank you so much for inviting me to sit on this panel. And we look forward, Antigua and Barbuda look forward to participate in the IRIS initiative. And I will be short. So like Mauritius, Antigua and Barbuda, many of the countries in the Caribbean area are looking at our infrastructure. And we're doing a lot of groundwork that we've never done before to kind of design, to decide what is the adaptation target for them. Like how high do you raise your bridge? How much land space you're going to lose? How wide should your waterways be? How far is the setback? Those are some of the questions. And right now it's unclear because we have no idea if we're aiming for 1.5 degrees or 2.5, 3. That's really difficult for us to do. And as all of you would know, it takes years to collect the data and put together a package of programs of infrastructure projects. So this is something, there's so much uncertainty in the data that you have to collect because there's a huge difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So this is why we work so hard here at the Climate Change COP so that we can keep it well below 1.5 and below. The second thing is that I'm a member of the Standing Committee on Finance. I represent AOSIS on that committee. And they've completed their first needs assessment report. And that report shows, for the first time, we've completed a report that shows that on a per capita basis, LDCs, smaller and developing states, and emerging economies spend at least twice as much on a capital project, a development project, than most other countries. Now, if you wonder why smaller and developing states are so indebted, now you begin to understand. So what we pay, us as a citizen of a small and developing state, like South Africa, would pay a lot less. And that has to do with many different things, including scale. So as Salwin mentioned before he left, the GDP per capita criteria for access is not accurate. And we have a lot of data to suggest otherwise. And it's a no-brainer for AOSIS and LDCs to change that. Because in the global scheme of things, we don't even spend 2% of the money. So why do you still apply that criteria to us? And finally, the third thing, in terms of when we're completing the design, we know what we want, we're ready to go forward, and we can work with partners such as India and others and learn from them. And that connection will help us to reduce some of the cost. But in AOSIS countries and in SIDS and in my own country, we need to restructure, in addition to having an old system set up by the World Bank and others. In many of our countries, our Ministry of Finance is also old and archaic, and we need to change it. So if we want to finance our infrastructure, resilience finance with grants, plus equity, plus the private sector, and so on, we need to start to structure our ministries of finance to be able to do that. So many of us have a debt management unit in the Ministry of Finance. Many don't have a grant management unit. Many of us don't have an equity unit or financing unit. In mine, we just have a debt management unit. So, I mean, we can program a loan perfectly and expertly, but we struggle to program a grant. We struggle to program equity and to put together a public-private partnership. Sorry. I have a cold as well. So I'm going to stop right there before I start coughing, but we need to also position ourselves to better access. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Blacklean. Do you want some water? I think those were very, very insightful remarks, ranging from talking about how do we deal with uncertainty when we are designing infrastructure to the unique challenge that SIDS face in terms of lack of economies of scale. You highlighted that for the infrastructure, the capital investment you make in SIDS per capita, it's twice if not more than that of that in other countries. And some of the fundamental structural issues of, you talked about how ministries of finance look at long-term investments, what is the kind of capability we have. So very thankful that you took time to engage with us in this conversation. And this is only one of the first of our long-standing conversations that will continue. With that, let me invite Mr. Carlos Lee Moresi to share his reflections. You can either speak from there or you can come at the lectern.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me. First of all, I want to acknowledge CDRI and for the great initiative they've come through with establishing the infrastructure for resilience development in the island states. I think the science and what we know the difficulties are and the challenges are, they're well documented, they're well known. The question we should be stepping into is how do we actually translate that into practical solutions? How do we make sure that the infrastructure developments that going forward is resilient? Of course, we have these other factors already been spoken about with the impacts of climate change. I just want to start off by giving an image, which we've all been in Glasgow for a few days now, for a week. Some of the buildings in the city of Glasgow are 500 years old. To me, that is resilience. That is an image of resilience building. How do we actually translate? Of course, I'm sure 500 years ago when they developed those buildings, they did not factor in climate change. Now we're in different space, different world. We have to factor in climate change. How do we then ensure that the appropriate infrastructure are put in place? A colleague from the Caribbean mentioned obviously the isolation of geospatial spacing in the Pacific Island states to spread out. So you have that challenge: is where do I put the port? Where do I construct the road? How much land am I going to take up? Those are valid questions. Underlying that and how we layer it, and I think this is where IRIS will come in terms of integration. What's needed is all these different sectors to collaborate, work together, and integrate into the planning. Before you talk about infrastructure, actual buildings construction, you have to go right back to the start and have a needs assessment. You have to have an infrastructure that's linked to economic development. We can't just talk about infrastructure in isolation. It has to be related to economic development. And economic development is translated into how do we get improvement in the quality of life for our people? And how do we then maintain that despite the challenges of climate change? One of the issues that we obviously is an issue for PSIDS, and speaking from a regional perspective, access has been spoken about, but it's also the issue of effectiveness. We can access finance, but how do we actually ensure that it's been applied effectively? We have to look at how we structure the financing of infrastructures in terms of financial structures. We have to look at who do we partner with. Obviously, from a PSIDS perspective, and I'm talking from a regional perspective from the Pacific Island Forum, we have to ensure that we're not incurring more debt for our member countries. So obviously, grants financing is appropriate. We also, at the same time, we can develop a private sector, and this is where the PPPs, the private-public partnerships come into play. But we need the MDBs, multi-development banks, to also work with us in terms of this, what I'm talking about, in structuring the financing for infrastructures, that is appropriate and does not incur further burden on top of the burden of climate change and disaster risk. I'll stop there for now and welcome more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that perspective from the Pacific Island Forum. Very useful. I think the point you made about cross-sectoral integration before rushing into a specific infrastructure project, step back, look at the big picture, very important. And we hope that IRIS is going to be able to work with countries in addressing exactly that concern. Let's hear some more from the Pacific. We have Madam Luisa Tuafitu Malolo from the Kingdom of Tonga. The floor is yours. You've joined us virtually, so we are all yours.
Malolo and good morning from the friendly islands of Tonga. I would like to thank the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure for hosting this very important event, and also giving Tonga an opportunity to share our views and our experiences. Well, with regards to resilient infrastructure in Tonga, what we have in place now. We have various documents in place. For example, the Tonga climate change policy, and also the Tonga Joint National Action Plan on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management. In those documents, we have 6 priority objectives, and those priority objectives are closely aligned with the goal and the outcomes of this IRIS, the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States. The issues that we are currently facing with regards to resilient infrastructure is the issues and the priorities they are already highlighted in these 2 documents. And we are looking forward to participate in this initiative, so that we can work very closely with IRIS in replicating and also scaling up the good actions that we've already implemented here in Tonga. And I'm sure the SIDS, they are also having the same proposal. Well, what we have experienced with regards to the issues in Tonga is that with regards to data, we need robust scientific data in order to inform decision making and also effective planning. We have done assessment and resilient assessments in previous years, but I think we need to
I think, have we lost the connection? Because I think she's frozen on the screen. If that's the case, maybe we can come back to her, but I thought I will sort of have one final round of questions from our very distinguished panel here. You know, 6 days ago, we had the launch of IRIS. It has committed itself to starting the implementation of its work in sometime in 2022 after a deliberative inception phase. And the first phase will last up to 2030. So my simple question, and I'm starting with Madam Blacklane, is that in 2 years from now, or let's give it 3 years, in 3 years from now, from your perspective, what should IRIS have delivered for you to be able to say that it has been successful, it has been useful? In 3 years from now, although we have a time horizon up to 2030, but in 3 years from now, if there were 1 or 2 key indicators of success of IRIS working with the small island developing states, what would those be? Yes, it's on now.
Okay, thanks. So, well, I heard the Honorable Minister mention satellite images and data. If you can get satellite images and data in a searchable format and it's downscale to a few meters, that would be that changes everything. And if you can have that in years, especially island states that are so tiny, that at Antigua and Barbuda, as part of their national adaptation plan, spending almost $1 million just to downscale data at 12 kilometers. So for most islands, that's the whole island. So if you can get downscale data with satellite data, which is much better, I mean, that changes everything. You can do appropriate hydrological studies, modeling, especially if you have the software to complete the modeling. I can tell you this, IRENA provided Antigua and Barbuda with a software that is still working out the kinks. You know how these things are. And you can actually go onto that website and look at your own building that you live in, your home, and map how much solar panels you can generate from your roof space or your land space, and give you the actual calculation of the investments and your return on your investment. So if we could just get that, that would change everything.
Thank you very much. That's a very specific ask, that if we had better geospatial information based on space-based technologies, I think that would make a lot of difference to SIDS. May I turn the same question to Honorable Minister? If there was one or two things that you would like IRIS to deliver in the next 2-3 years, what would those be? And you can't say what Ambassador Blackburn said. You have to come up with something new.
Sure, I fully concur what has been said by my friend. I would say that without derogating from what has been requested from small island, the main concern is still access to finance. But I would say that the particular problem of small islands is that we have so many islands in different regions, and it's rather difficult on an infrastructural point of view to have a good communication network for all these islands, and to have the necessary platform to have an approach which is more proactive and coordinated. And I would say also, and I would say the second request coming from a SIDS country would be the issue of capacity building itself, because I think the challenge that we are facing today, challenge of climate change, it's an ever-changing challenge. And I think years passing by, and we are going to face some more aggravating situation. And we need to give the necessary impetus to the issue of capacity building. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Very, very crisp asks, in terms of improving access to finance, capacity development. How do we address the challenge of achieving economies of scale when the islands are far removed, and how do the communication networks work in those situations? So these are some of the challenges that IRIS will have to contend with. Let's hear the perspective of the Pacific Island Forum, and I address the same question to you. What are one or two key indicators of success, usefulness in a few years from now for IRIS?
Great, thank you, moderator. And I really appreciate the question, but let me frame my response in terms of the video that we saw right at the start. The video referred to the Simon pathway, which is the SIDS accelerated modality of action. We in the Pacific, we also have another a framework. It's called the FRDP, or the Framework for Resilience Development in the Pacific. And it is really important that we don't duplicate stuff. So the IRIS comes and works alongside what we have already established. With that said, I'm also glad to hear that the IRIS program is projected to go to 2030. We've just recently in our Finance and Economic Ministers meeting extended our FRDP framework to 2030. So from that perspective, alignments to what's already existing in some of the countries is really important, that we don't have to duplicate. And I say that in response or alongside the comments from the Honorable Minister around capacity development. Let me just be controversial here and say I'm sick of hearing capacity development in small island states. We have plenty of capacity. What we need is capacity enhancement. We have well-trained professionals. We have well-qualified engineers. What they don't have is the exposure to resilience development. What they don't have is the appropriate attachment to appropriate development institutions. That's what we need. And I said it in the context also in one of my colleagues in the Pacific who said, in the Pacific, when you talk about capacity, for example, the Ministry of Finance, you lose 2 of your most senior staff, there's 20% of your capacity reduced. Compared to a large country like the UK, you lose 2 staff, you don't even feel it. So there's a perspective from capacity that I really want to put on the table. But the donors and the developed nations need to see that we have capacity, just needs enhancement. So in terms of a specific ask, so I mentioned the FRDP, the Framework for Resilience Development in the Pacific. Alongside that, we have developed the Pacific Resilience Standards. What I would like IRIS is to partner with us and develop the Pacific Resilience Standards or standards for SIDS so that we have something to measure resilience development against. We talk about resilience development. The question is, how do you know you have reached resilience? You need to set a standard. You need to set a measure. So to me, that is a starting point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were 3 very, very clear, crisp points. Number 1, do not duplicate anything. Alongside Samoa Pathway, look at FRDP, work in tandem with what the SIDS are already doing. And that's, I think, a sentiment which was clearly expressed in the launch video as well as all the IRIS documentation. That's a key guiding principle. So supplement, not supplant the local capacity. The second point you made that, you know, the whole issue of capacity enhancement as opposed to, you know, capacity building, which basically means that you build on the capacity that already exists and look at the unique challenges of capacity in the SIDS. And finally, you talked about alignment because we're talking about 2030. There are already Pacific resilience standards. How do we come up with resilience matrix so that we can actually look at the progress we are making on the ground? So thank you very much. I'm sure my colleagues at CDRI are taking copious notes of what you're saying. With that, let me turn to our colleague from Tonga, Ms. Luisa Afitu Malolo. I'm sorry you were disconnected the first time around. So I'm coming back to you. The question for you is that you've heard about IRIS. It was launched 6 days ago. We've had some discussion just now. So in a few years from now, if you were to look at the usefulness of IRIS for the small island nations, what would be the key indicators of success that, you know, it has worked, it has been useful?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, in my previous remarks, I was just about to mention in Tonga with regards to finance. In Tonga, we have established a Tonga Climate Change Trust Fund, where we have envisaged this as a viable, sustainable financing mechanism for Tonga. So with our priority for IRIS, perhaps IRIS can consider this financing mechanism already in place for IRIS to contribute to Tonga Trust Fund. Not only that, but also like what my fellow colleague from the Pacific had mentioned earlier, that we have already have a series of climate and disaster resilient documents in place. We would like IRIS to, use those existing documents where we have highlighted our priorities and our challenges there for IRIS to consider. Not only that, but also one of our major challenges here is with regards to technology and also capacity building. So perhaps it's an area that IRIS would consider in assisting Tonga with this initiative.
Thank you very much. I think we had a very rich discussion in this round. There are very clear, there's a clear path for IRIS. I think the constant and very useful reminder that do not duplicate what is already being done. There are frameworks, there are pathways such as Samoa pathway, work alongside them, help improve them, help improve their implementation rather than start something else. Ambassador Blacklin talked about, specific ask, how do you improve access to space-based information, which can be applied for planning purposes in SIDS. Honorable Minister talked about how IRIS can help make projects such that, it improves access to finance. There is the discussion of different shades of capacity building, capacity development, capacity enhancement, given that small island nations have fewer people, capacity challenges are also unique. You gave the very vivid example that if 2 people leave, you have 10% reduction in capacity. So we have to contend with all of that. And with that, I think if we work together, we can actually deliver something very specific, very useful for SIDS. The CDRI Secretariat will continue to sort of look at you for your guidance, encouragement, and support to making it all work on the ground. It is ultimately about the people. And if people benefit from whatever work we do, it is a success. And, the next hurricane, the next flood, the next cyclone that happens, and if we are able to show measurable reduction in losses, the next time a small island nation in the Caribbean or the Pacific or the Indian Ocean is affected by a cyclone or a hurricane or typhoon, depending on which region you are, and the electricity doesn't go off for more than 6 hours, that's a success. That's what in the end matters. And we have to keep really ourselves focused on this. The next 10 years are exciting. Let's make them useful for our people in the small island nations as well. With that, I would like to close this session, unless Excellencies have anything else to add at this point. This is only the beginning of a conversation to turn these ideas into action on the ground and make a difference for people in small island nations who are already facing the brunt of climate change impacts. Thank you very much.